The signal made no sense, and that was the first thing Lieutenant Commander Marin Salve noticed. She was sitting at the navigation console aboard the TSN Ardennes, a 900-meter dreadnought at the center of Battle Group Scythe, when the passive array flagged an anomaly in the electromagnetic background of the Korath expanse. Not a contact, not a signal in any useful definition. Just a deviation in the cosmic static that her instruments said should not exist. A rhythmic modulation buried so deep in the background radiation that the automated filters had nearly erased it before her custom watchdog script caught the irregularity and pushed it to her secondary display. Marin stared at the waveform and felt the tightness start behind her eyes. She was 34 years old, a navigation officer with 11 years in the Terran Strategic Navy, and she had spent the last 3 of those years learning to trust that specific physical response. It was not intuition. It was not a hunch. It was a sensation in her orbital bones, a compression that appeared whenever data on her screen was lying about what it represented. She had felt it twice before. The first time, she had identified a navigational beacon that had been reprogrammed by pirates to lure freighters into an ambush corridor. The second time, she had detected an error in a star chart that would have taken the Ardennes through the outer corona of an uncharted brown dwarf. Both times, the data had looked correct. Both times, her eyes had told her it wasn't. Both times she had been right. The numbers on her display were lying now. She was certain of it. "Captain Hargrove," she said, keeping her voice level, "I have an anomaly on the passive array, bearing 173 by -12. It is faint. It should not be there." Captain Elias Hargrove turned from the main viewport, where the brown-gray emptiness of the Korath expanse filled the glass like a held breath. He was a lean, quiet man of 56 who had commanded the Ardennes for 6 years, and who had learned early in that tenure that, when Marin Salve said something should not be there, the correct response was to stop everything else and listen. "Define it." "I cannot. That is the problem. The background radiation in this sector should be uniform. We are 40 light-years from the nearest active star. The Korath expanse is dead space, dust clouds, old debris, thermal noise from a brown dwarf that barely qualifies as stellar. There is nothing here to produce structured electromagnetic output, but there is a pattern in the noise on bearing 173, repeating every 14.3 seconds, with a frequency modulation that is not natural." Hargrove crossed to her station, his boots quiet on the deck plating. "Could be a pulsar echo, refraction through the dust. I ran the dispersion models. They do not fit. Pulsar echoes degrade in predictable ways as they propagate through interstellar medium. This signal maintains full coherence across the frequency spectrum. Something local is producing it." Battle Group Scythe consisted of 7 warships, the Ardennes as flagship, 3 heavy cruisers, the Resolute, the Tempest, and the Caledon, 2 destroyer escorts, the Kingsford and the Voss, and the fleet carrier Meridian carrying 4 squadrons of strike craft. They were 19 days into a patrol sweep of the Korath expanse, a region of space that the Terran Strategic Navy had been monitoring with growing unease for the past 8 months. Not because anything had happened there. Because things had stopped happening. Shipping lanes that had carried trade traffic for decades went quiet. Survey beacons placed by civilian exploration companies stopped transmitting, one by one, over a period of weeks. 3 independent freighters entered the expanse on scheduled routes and never emerged from the other side. No distress calls, no debris fields, no wreckage, no explanation. The Navy had sent 2 reconnaissance drones. Both transmitted routine telemetry for approximately 11 hours before their signals ceased simultaneously, as if something had reached out and closed a switch. Battle Group Scythe was the answer. 7 warships, 4,600 crew, enough combined firepower to glass a continent. Their orders were simple: conduct a systematic sweep, identify the source of the disappearances, report back. Engagement was authorized if hostile contact was made, but the emphasis was on intelligence. The Admiralty wanted to understand what was eating ships in the Korath expanse before it committed the fleet resources that the answer would inevitably demand. 19 days in, they had found nothing. Empty space, dead beacons, dust, the kind of nothing that pressed against the hull with a weight that routine could not shake, and that the crews had stopped joking about around day 12. The mess halls had grown quieter. Watch rotations that once carried the easy banter of veterans settled into long stretches of silence, punctuated only by instrument checks, and the low hum of the ventilation systems cycling filtered air through compartments that felt smaller with each passing day. Petty Officer Dahl, who ran the Ardennes Enlisted Recreation Lounge, had mentioned to Marin during a coffee run on day 15 that attendance had dropped by half. People were staying in their racks during off hours, sleeping or staring at the overhead, waiting for something to happen or for the patrol to end. The emptiness outside the hull had gotten inside. Until Marin's watchdog script caught a pattern that the automated filters had tried to discard. She pulled the waveform onto her main display and began running decomposition algorithms, stripping layers of noise to isolate the signal's fundamental structure. The work was methodical, precise, the kind of sustained deep focus analysis that made her forget she had a body. Her fingers moved across the console with the unconscious fluency of a musician, adjusting parameters, testing hypotheses, discarding dead ends and circling back to test them from different angles. The bridge crew gave her space. They had seen her work before. Lieutenant Rise, the officer of the watch, quietly redirected 2 routine navigation queries to his own station rather than interrupt her concentration. He had served with Marin for 4 years and knew that the particular set of her shoulders, the slight forward lean, the way her breathing slowed to match the rhythm of her keystrokes, meant she was threading a needle that no one else on the bridge could see. 40 minutes later, she had it isolated. The signal was not electromagnetic in the conventional sense. It was gravitational. A micro-oscillation in the local gravitational field, so slight that it registered as electromagnetic interference through secondary induction effects on the ship's sensor arrays. Something was rhythmically compressing and releasing spacetime at a frequency of 14.3 seconds, and it was doing it from a source that Marin's triangulation placed at approximately 900,000 kilometers from Battle Group Scythe's current position. She sat back in her chair. The tightness behind her eyes was worse. "Captain," she said, "it is not a signal, it is a heartbeat." Hargrove, who had returned to the command station to review the day's patrol schedule, looked at her with the particular stillness that preceded his hardest decisions. "Explain." "Gravitational micropulsations. Something at 900,000 clicks is rhythmically flexing local spacetime. Period. 14.3 seconds. Amplitude, barely above our detection threshold. Our instruments almost missed it because it presents as electromagnetic background noise on standard passive sweeps. I caught it only because my watchdog script monitors for non-random structure in the noise floor, and this has structure." "Natural phenomenon." "No, sir. The pulse is too regular, the waveform is too clean, and there is a second layer." She pulled up the spectral analysis she had run during decomposition, overlaying it with the navigation database's record of ship disappearances. I cross-referenced the pulse timing against the disappearance data. The 3 freighters that vanished each sent their last known signal from a different point in the expanse. But if I model the gravitational source as mobile, moving on a specific heading at a specific velocity, it would have been within 900,000 kilometers of each disappearance location at the time of last contact. She let the number sit. 900,000 kilometers, the exact distance, 3 times. Silence on the bridge. The specific silence that happens when people arrive at the same conclusion simultaneously, and no one wants to speak it first. "How long has it been within range of us?" Hargrove asked. Marin checked her calculations. ran them again with adjusted parameters for the battle group's own course changes over 19 days. The result did not change. 11 days, sir. Based on the trajectory model, the source has been pacing us since we crossed the Kelleran dust shelf on day 8, matching our course corrections, maintaining a constant standoff distance of 900,000 kilometers, staying inside the detection shadow of the dust clouds. It has been there since day 8, and we did not see it because we were not looking for gravitational anomalies, and because it is operating at an energy level specifically calibrated to sit below our standard detection thresholds. It knows our thresholds. Yes, sir. Whatever it is, it has studied our sensor capabilities well enough to operate precisely beneath them. That implies either prior observation of Terran strategic Navy vessels or access to technical data about our sensor architecture. Neither option is reassuring. Hargrove processed this for 4 seconds, the muscles along his jaw working once. Then he lifted the fleet-wide communications handset from its cradle. All ships battle group side, this is Ardennes Actual. Go to Condition 2, I say again Condition 2. Weapons free on positive hostile identification. Navigation, I want a full gravitational survey of our surrounding volume, maximum sensitivity, all bands. All passive arrays to broadband sweep. Do not go active. I say again, do not emit. We are being watched. Ardennes out. The bridge shifted from routine patrol posture to heightened readiness in 90 seconds. Stations that had been running automated watch rotations were suddenly staffed by alert officers who moved with the tight, controlled energy of people who had trained for exactly this, and had been waiting 19 days for it to arrive. The lights dimmed to combat blue, casting the bridge crew in cold tones that sharpened every shadow and made the tactical displays glow brighter by contrast. The main display lit with the positions of all 7 ships in patrol formation, sensor coverage bubbles overlapping in the standard mutual protection geometry. Below the bridge, Marin knew, the transformation was propagating through the ship like a pulse of its own. Damage control teams were suiting up, sealing emergency kit lockers, and running pressure checks on compartment bulkheads. The medical bay was converting from routine sick call configuration to mass casualty readiness, surgical teams verifying instrument sterilization and laying out triage markers. In the forward magazine, ammunition handlers were removing the safety locks on the rail gun capacitor banks, the heavy clunk of each lock disengaging audible 2 decks away through the structural steel. The Ardennes had been designed to transition from peace to war in under 3 minutes. Her crew could do it in 2. Marin kept working. The gravitational pulse was her thread, and she was going to follow it until it led her to whatever was producing it or until it stopped. Over the next 2 hours, she built a picture that worsened with every layer of resolution she added. The source was not a single point. It was distributed, multiple gravitational emitters, all pulsing at the same base frequency of 14.3 seconds, but with phase offsets that indicated individual sources spaced across a volume roughly 200 kilometers in diameter. She counted them by isolating each distinct phase signature from the composite waveform, a process that required her to run the gravitational equivalent of acoustic separation on data that had never been designed for that purpose. 47 confirmed sources before the noise floor consumed the weaker signals at the edges of the formation. 47, each one producing gravitational micropulsations, each one maintaining formation with the others. Each one moving through the dust cloud with coordination that spoke of either a shared controlling intelligence or a communication system that operated on principles the Terran strategic navy had never encountered. Captain, Marin said, there are at least 47 of them. They are in formation, and they are closing. The tactical display updated as she fed her analysis into the combat tracking system. 47 amber contacts appeared in a loose sphere approximately 900,000 kilometers out, distributed across a 200-kilometer volume. As the bridge crew watched, the sphere began to contract. The contacts were moving inward, toward them. Closing speed, Hargrove asked. 12 kilometers per second. At current rate, they reach estimated weapons range in approximately 4 hours. Can you characterize them? Working on it. Marin's hands moved with controlled urgency. She was pulling everything the gravitational data could yield, using pulse characteristics to estimate mass, energy output, physical dimensions. Each source has an estimated mass of approximately 600,000 tons. Physical extent uncertain without visual confirmation, but the gravitational profile suggests objects on the order of 300 to 500 meters along the major axis. Energy output consistent with sustained fusion-level power generation per unit. They are not asteroids, not debris, not any natural formation. They are vessels, sir, or organisms, or something that erases the distinction. Reports arrived from the other ships. The heavy cruiser Resolute had independently detected gravitational interference to port. The destroyer Kingsford reported anomalous drift in her inertial navigation system that her engineering team could not explain. The carrier Meridian's Combat Information Center confirmed they were tracking the same contacts, and their count was higher, 53. The Meridian's more sensitive deep space arrays had resolved 6 additional contacts that the Ardennes instruments had lost in the noise. 53 contacts, 600,000 tons each, closing at 12 kilometers per second. Marin ran the math without being asked. 53 entities at 600,000 tons, 31.8 million tons of material converging on a battle group, displacing approximately 4.2 million tons, a mass ratio of nearly 8 to 1. She reported the number. The bridge absorbed it in silence. Marin saw Lieutenant Rise grip the edge of his console, his knuckles whitening for a moment before he caught himself and forced his hands flat. At the weapons station, Ensign Torval, 2 years out of the academy and on her first deep space deployment, had gone very still. Her eyes moved between her targeting display and the tactical overview, with the rapid, searching quality of someone looking for the piece of information that would make the situation less dire than it appeared. She would not find it. There was no such piece. Hargrove studied the display. Helm, bring the formation to heading 285, all ahead standard. Let us see if they adjust. The Ardennes turned. The 6 other ships followed, the formation pivoting with practiced coordination. On the display, the sphere of amber contacts shifted in response, adjusting its approach vector to match the battle group's new heading. The closing speed did not change. The formation geometry did not waver. The adjustment was complete within 6 seconds. They're tracking us, Hargrove said quietly. More than tracking, sir, Marin replied. They adjusted within 6 seconds of our course change. Whatever communication system they use, the coordination latency across a 200-kilometer formation is less than 3 seconds. That is faster than our own tactical data network. What are we dealing with, Solvay? She had been asking herself the same question with increasing urgency since the first decomposition. The gravitational signatures, the distributed formation, the subthreshold operating profile, the coordination speed. She cross-referenced every contact report, every anomaly file, every intelligence briefing she had absorbed in 11 years. Nothing matched. Something new, Captain. Nothing in the Terran Strategic Navy's threat database corresponds to these signatures. The operating profile suggests a collective intelligence, individual units functioning as elements of a distributed system. The gravitational pulsations may serve as their communication medium, which would explain the coordination speed. Gravitational waves propagate at light speed. If each entity is both receiver and transmitter, the entire formation functions as a single networked organism. A hive mind. Functionally, yes. Whether there is a central directing intelligence or the behavior emerges from the network interaction, I cannot yet determine, but they are coordinated. They are deliberate. They have been studying us for 11 days while we swept empty space, and now they are closing to engagement range. Hargrove turned to his communications officer. Directional comm beam to Fleet Command. Burst transmission. Include Solvay's complete analysis package. All gravitational data, trajectory modeling, mass estimates. If we do not come back, the Admiralty needs to know what lives in the Korath expanse. The burst launched. Transit time to the nearest relay buoy and then to Fleet Command, 41 hours. Whatever happened in the next 4 hours, no help was coming. Marin felt the weight of that number settle over the bridge like pressure at depth. 41 hours. The message would arrive long after the outcome was decided, carrying either the data that would prepare the next battle group or the last words of a formation that had ceased to exist. She pushed the thought aside. 41 hours was a problem for people who survived the next 4. Marin returned to her console and did what she always did when the situation demanded more than experience could provide. She watched the data and waited for it to say something it had not said yet. At 3 hours and 14 minutes before projected contact, the gravitational pulse frequency changed. The steady 14.3-second rhythm shifted, 13.9 seconds, then 13.1, then 12.4. The heartbeat was accelerating. "They are ramping up," she reported. "Pulse frequency increasing across the formation. If this is their communication medium, higher frequency means higher data throughput. They are coordinating, something more complex than station keeping." At 2 hours and 40 minutes, the Meridian's long-range optical array captured the first visual. Marin pulled the feed onto her secondary display, and the tightness behind her eyes became something close to pain. They were not ships, not in any sense that human engineering would recognize. Each entity was a roughly ovoid structure approximately 400 meters along its major axis, surfaced in a material that absorbed nearly all visible light, rendering them as dark voids against the already dark backdrop of the dust cloud. But the surfaces were not static. They rippled, undulated. The material shifted and rearranged itself in patterns that corresponded exactly to the gravitational pulse frequency, the surface of each entity flexing in synchronization with the oscillation, as if the pulse was not merely transmitted by the entity, but was a fundamental expression of its physical process. They were not flying through space. They were swimming through it. The gravitational pulses were the strokes of their passage, rhythmic compressions of spacetime that served simultaneously as propulsion, communication, and presence. Each entity was self-contained, alive or so perfectly engineered to simulate life that the distinction had ceased to matter, moving through the void with the coordinated grace of abyssal predators that had never seen light and never needed to. Marin studied the visual feed with a navigator's eye, cataloging details that might matter later. The surface undulations were not random. They propagated from a point near one end of each ovoid, traveling along the major axis in a wave pattern that completed its cycle in exactly one pulse period. The leading end, if that designation applied, was slightly narrower than the trailing mass. There were no visible apertures, no sensor domes, no engine ports, nothing that corresponded to any functional anatomy she could recognize. The entities were seamless. Whatever sensory apparatus they used, whatever mechanisms drove their gravitational manipulation, was internal, integrated so completely into the organism's structure that the boundary between biology and function had dissolved. "Designate them," Hargrove ordered. Marin's console required a tactical classification for the tracking system. She typed the first word that came to mind, placed there by the visual with the force of recognition: Leviathan. Contact group designated Leviathan. 53 units confirmed. Closing speed now 18 kilometers per second, a 50% increase in the last 40 minutes. And Captain, the formation has changed. They were in a sphere. Now they are compressing into a disk. The leading edge is densifying. They are forming a wall. A wall, 53 entities, each 400 meters long, each massing 600,000 tons, flattening into a planar formation that would present maximum contact surface to battle group size. Not a defensive geometry. An envelopment geometry. A net drawing closed around prey that had not known until 40 minutes ago that it was prey. Hargrove made the call. All ships Condition 1, battle stations, weapons free on all designated Leviathan contacts. Helm heading 090 all ahead flank. Formation Kilo defensive spread. Meridian launch all fighter squadrons. The battle group surged. Engine flares painted the surrounding dust in amber light as 7 warships accelerated to combat speed, their formation widening into the defensive spread that maximized overlapping fields of fire. The carrier Meridian cycled fighters from her launch bays, 4 squadrons in rapid succession, 48 strike craft spilling into the void and fanning out to establish a forward screen. Marin watched the Leviathan wall adjust. Within 8 seconds, the entire formation reoriented to match the battle group's new heading. 53 entities across a 100-kilometer front, synchronized to within fractions of a second. They adapted before we completed our turn, she said. They are not reacting. They are predicting. 11 days of observation has given them a model of how we maneuver. They knew what we would do before we did it. The gap closed. 900,000 kilometers became 600, 500, 400. The gravitational pulses cycled at 8.1 seconds now, fast enough that Marin felt a faint vibration through the Ardennes deck plating, a subsonic thrum that traveled through the ship's structural frame and registered in her bones. The ship was resonating with the enemy's heartbeat. She noticed other crew members shifting uncomfortably at their stations, rolling their shoulders, adjusting their footing. No one mentioned it. The vibration was below the threshold of conscious hearing, but their bodies knew it was there, a pressure that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the architecture of the skeleton. At 400,000 kilometers, the Leviathan struck. Not with a weapon in any conventional sense. The gravitational pulse frequency spiked to 2.4 seconds, and the leading edge of the wall emitted a focused gravitational wave that crossed the distance and hit battle group size forward elements like a wall of pressure that had no substance. The destroyer Kingsford, positioned at the formation's leading edge, shuddered as her structural frame absorbed tidal stresses that exceeded her design tolerances by a factor of 3. Hull stress alarms cascaded across the fleet channel. The Kingsford's captain reported microfractures forming along her dorsal spine, frame stations 17 through 29 flexing beyond elastic limits. Gravity as a weapon, directed gravitational compression that applied differential tidal forces across every physical structure in its path, not explosive, not thermal, not kinetic in any traditional sense. The wave did not smash the ships, it squeezed them, stretched one hull section while compressing another. Stressed joints and structural members in ways that human warships had never been built to resist, because no one had conceived of this kind of attack. Damage report all ships, Hargrove ordered. The Kingsford, microfractures in non-critical structural members, no breach combat capable. The Resolute, sensor calibration disrupted by gravitational interference recalibrating. The Tempest and Caledon, structural stress within acceptable parameters. The Ardennes, no damage, her heavier construction absorbing the wave without complaint. The wave had been a test, a ranging shot. The Leviathans were calibrating the force required to break human hulls. Return fire, Hargrove said. Main batteries full salvo. Target the densest section of the wall. The Ardennes' 12 forward-mounted magnetic accelerators fired. 60-kilogram tungsten penetrators, launched at 5% of light speed kinetic lances, carrying the energy of heavy torpedoes in dense, unevadable packages. The 3 heavy cruisers added their fire. 54 rail gun rounds in a saturation spread designed to fill a 3-kilometer volume with metal moving at 15,000 kilometers per second. The slugs hit, and the leviathans parted. Marin watched it happen on the gravitational display, the only instrument that could track them with precision through the dust. The instant the rounds entered the formation's volume, the entities in the impact zone flowed apart like dark water, opening gaps that the tungsten penetrators passed through without touching anything. Then the gaps closed. The wall reformed. The slugs continued on their ballistic trajectories into empty space beyond, striking nothing. The entire evasion took 1.7 seconds. Negative impact, the weapons officer reported, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a professional who does not believe what his instruments are telling him. All rounds passed through the formation without contact. 0 hits on 54 rounds. They dodged, Marin said. They read the incoming trajectories, predicted the impact points, and moved individual entities out of the path. In under 2 seconds, for 54 simultaneous inbound rounds, each entity moved independently but in coordination with its neighbors, opening gaps exactly where needed and closing them immediately after. Firing into the wall is functionally equivalent to firing into water. A cold understanding settled through the bridge. Marin could see it moving from station to station, the realization arriving on each face in its own way. A tightening of the mouth, a slow exhale, a hand briefly pressed flat against a console as if seeking something solid. They had fired their heaviest conventional weapons at maximum saturation density, and the enemy had simply flowed around the attack like a curtain parting for a breeze. Every tactical doctrine they carried, every firing solution their computers could generate, assumed a target that occupied fixed space. These targets did not. The rules had changed, and the new rules were written in a language that their weapons did not speak. The second gravitational wave hit 40 seconds later. Harder. The pulse frequency had dropped to 1.8 seconds, the oscillations faster and stronger. The Kingsford's microfractures widened. A secondary hull plate on her ventral surface buckled inward with a sound that her crew heard through 3 decks of insulation. The cruiser Tempest reported a primary coolant line rupture, her engineering team scrambling to isolate the break before coolant loss reached the reactor's thermal management system. The carrier Meridian, the heaviest ship in the formation, groaned through her structural frame with a deep resonant complaint that her 4,000 crew members felt through the deck plates, a sound that said the bones of the ship were bending. Marin's hands had not stopped moving since the first gravitational wave. She was deep in the data now, pulling the pulse signatures apart with focused intensity that excluded the alarms, the damage reports, the sounds of her own ship flexing under stresses it was never meant to bear. Because there was something in the data she almost had, a pattern within the pattern. The tightness behind her eyes was not just present now, it was screaming at her. The Leviathan's pulses were not uniform. She had assumed they were because the base frequency had been constant since first detection. But now, with the frequency climbing and the formation under combat stress, variations were emerging that the earlier steady-state data had hidden. Micro-deviations in the pulse timing of individual entities. Most were synchronized to within a fraction of a millisecond. But 7 were not. 7 entities whose pulses lagged by 3 to 4 milliseconds. 3 milliseconds. In human terms, nothing. A blink of an eye took 300 milliseconds. 3 milliseconds was the time it took a nerve impulse to travel 2 centimeters. But this was not a human nervous system. This was a distributed intelligence that coordinated 53 entities across a 100-kilometer front in under 2 seconds. In that system, 3 milliseconds was not noise. It was architecture. Marin isolated the 7 lagging entities and plotted their positions within the formation. They were not at the edges, where slower units might be expected. They were near the center, distributed in a pattern that her spatial geometry training immediately recognized. optimized for coverage. Each lagging entity was positioned to minimize the maximum signal path length to every other entity in the formation. The arrangement was not random. It was not approximate. It was mathematically precise. The solution to a classic network optimization problem that communications engineers had been solving for centuries. They were relay nodes, processing hubs. Every gravitational pulse that traveled through the formation was being routed through these 7 points, and the 3-millisecond delay was computational overhead. The time each node spent receiving, integrating, processing, and retransmitting the collective's coordination data. Not a flaw in their design, the cost of their function. The 7 entities were not slower than the others. They were doing more work. Without them, the pulses would have no routing structure. The communication would fragment into noise. The coordination that let the wall dodge rail gun rounds in 1.7 seconds would collapse into 53 individual organisms acting on 53 separate impulses. Marin ran the analysis twice more, adjusting her detection parameters each time to confirm she was not fitting noise to a theory. The 3-millisecond lag appeared in all 3 runs. The same 7 entities, the same positions, the same optimization geometry. She allowed herself a single breath that was deeper than the others. The kind of breath that comes at the moment a complex equation resolves, when hours of work converge on a result that is either salvation or delusion, and the only way to know which is to act on it. She thought of the 2 previous times she had felt the tightness behind her eyes. The pirate beacon, the uncharted brown dwarf. Both times the gap between seeing the answer and trusting it had felt like stepping off a ledge. Both times the ground had been there. She needed it to be there now. "Captain," she said, and her voice had changed. The careful uncertainty that had colored every report since the first anomaly was gone, replaced by something flat and precise that Hargrove had heard from her exactly twice before, both times immediately before she saved the ship. "I have their network architecture." Hargrove turned from the main display, where the Leviathan wall was now at 300,000 kilometers, and the third gravitational wave was visibly building as a compression front on the gravitational sensors. 7 coordination nodes distributed through the formation center. They are the collective's processing infrastructure, relay hubs that route and integrate the gravitational signals, keeping all 53 entities synchronized. Every pulse passes through them. Every evasion command, every attack wave coordination, every formation adjustment is processed through these 7 relay points. The 3-millisecond delay is the computational cost of their function. And if we remove them, the network loses its routing layer. The coordination collapses. 53 entities become 53 individuals, each pulsing at its own frequency, unable to synchronize evasion, unable to coordinate attack waves, unable to maintain formation geometry. The wall breaks. You can target them. I can give you real-time coordinates for all 7, updated continuously based on pulse timing analysis. But rail guns will not work. The formation will see the trajectories and flow around the rounds the same way they did the first salvo. We need close-range engagement. Fighters. Short-range kinetic weapons with flight times measured in fractions of a second. Close enough that the 3-millisecond processing delay of the nodes themselves becomes the critical limiting factor. If the strike arrives faster than the nodes can process an evasion command, they cannot coordinate the response. The third gravitational wave hit while she spoke. The Kingsford lost a 3-meter section of dorsal armor, the structural backing failing along fracture lines the first 2 waves had established. Her captain reported the damage control team was spot welding emergency bracing into place, but the structural analysis was clear. 2 more waves at this amplitude would compromise hull integrity beyond recovery. The Tempest's coolant line repair had cost them one of 3 reactor cooling circuits, dropping her available power to 70%. The Ardennes creaked, a long grinding sound that traveled through the bridge like a slow exhalation, structural members at their limits, reminding everyone aboard that limits existed. Hargrove opened a channel to the carrier. Meridian Actual, this is Ardennes. Retask Dagger and Spearhead squadrons for close-range precision strike inside the hostile formation. My navigation officer is transmitting target packages now. Commander Thurin, these are simultaneous kill targets. All 7 nodes must be destroyed within a 1-second execution window. If any node survives to retransmit, the network reconstitutes and we are back to fighting the wall. Copy, Ardennes. What kind of targeting solution are we looking at? Non-standard. Your pilots will be engaging targets defined by gravitational pulse timing signatures, not radar returns or visual contact. The targeting data is mathematical. They will fly to where the math says the targets must be. Trust the data. Ardennes out. Marin transmitted the targeting packages. They were unlike anything the Meridian's fighter pilots had ever received. Not coordinates, but mathematical descriptions. Gravitational pulse phase offsets. Predicted node positions based on formation dynamics modeling. Probability volumes updated every 2 seconds as the formation shifted. The pilots would not see their targets on any instrument in their cockpits. They would fly on trust in a navigation officer's interpretation of 3-millisecond timing delays in gravitational oscillations, detected by a console built for plotting courses around asteroids. She imagined the briefing room aboard the Meridian, Commander Thurin standing before the assembled pilots of Dagger and Spearhead squadrons, their faces lit by the blue glow of the tactical projector as the targeting data populated their displays. She imagined the silence as they absorbed what was being asked of them. No visual confirmation, no radar lock, no targeting reticle. Just coordinates derived from mathematics, updated in real time, pointing them into the interior of a formation of organisms that could compress spacetime with a thought. The kind of mission that required a specific form of courage, not the courage to face danger, which every combat pilot possessed, but the courage to trust someone else's data with your life. Dagger and Spearhead are away, the Meridian reported. 48 birds, weapons hot. Estimated time to strike positions, 14 minutes. 14 minutes. The Kingsford had perhaps 19 minutes before the next 2 gravitational waves degraded her structure beyond combat viability. 5 minutes of margin between the fighters arriving and the destroyer breaking apart. Marin noted the math and continued refining. She tracked the 7 nodes continuously, updating their positions as the formation rippled and shifted. The Leviathans were fluid. Individual entities traded positions within the wall, the structure undulating like a living membrane responding to stimuli. But the nodes held their relative positions within the network topology. They had to. Their function required specific geometric relationships with the entities they served, optimized signal path lengths that would degrade if the nodes drifted beyond their assigned stations. They could shift with the formation as a whole. They could not relocate independently within it. Not far enough. Not fast enough. That was the constraint that Marin had found. The architecture that made them essential was the architecture that pinned them in place. The processing function that gave the collective its coordination was the function that made the nodes predictable. The 4th gravitational wave hit at 12 minutes to strike. The Kingsford's captain reported catastrophic fracturing along the keel. The ship was bending, her structural spine deforming under tidal stresses that no destroyer had ever been built to endure. Structural integrity at 61% and falling with every pulse cycle. He requested permission to withdraw. Hargrove granted it. The Kingsford pulled back from formation, her engines firing unevenly as the warped frame transmitted thrust loads through structural paths that were no longer straight. The destroyer Voss moved forward to fill the gap, her captain broadcasting a terse acknowledgement that carried the undertone of someone who had just watched what was happening to the Kingsford and was now placing herself in the same position. It was the kind of decision that would never appear in an official report with any emotion attached to it, just a notation of formation adjustment and reallocation of defensive coverage. But Marin heard it in the captain's voice, the careful control of someone who understood exactly what the next gravitational wave would do to her ship and had chosen to be there anyway. 10 minutes. Marin split her attention between the node tracking and the broader formation behavior, feeding corrections to the fighter squadrons while monitoring the collective's response to the approaching strike force. The Leviathans had noticed the fighters. The wall was adjusting, entities in the outer layer beginning to flow and shift in patterns that looked, to Marin's practiced eye, like a predator repositioning to deal with smaller prey while keeping pressure on the larger targets. 8 minutes. The fifth gravitational wave. The cruiser Tempest lost main power for 11 seconds as structural flexing induced simultaneous thermal transients in her two remaining reactor cooling circuits. When power returned, her captain's report was precisely controlled in the way that conceals proximity to disaster. One more wave at this amplitude would force a reactor scram, a heavy cruiser dead in space. In front of 53 organisms that squeezed ships apart with gravity, and had been doing it to freighters and drones in the Korath expanse for months. The cruiser Kaladin reported hairline fractures forming in her port weapon mounts. The Resolute sensor arrays were experiencing gravitational lensing effects that distorted her firing solutions. The Ardennes structural monitoring system flagged 3 frame stations on the ventral surface where stress loads had exceeded 90% of rated capacity. 7 minutes. The fighters entered the outer boundary of the Leviathan formation. Marin watched the gravitational data shift as the collective registered the intrusion. Entities in the outer layer began flowing, opening channels the way they had for the rail gun slugs. But fighters were not ballistic rounds on fixed trajectories. They were piloted craft with lateral thrust, and the pilots were following Marin's continuously updated coordinates, adjusting course in real time. The collective adapted. 3 entities in the outer wall converged on Dagger Squadron's leading flight, compressing the local spacetime around the fighters with focused gravitational pulses. The pilots' instruments went haywire. 2 fighters broke away, their pilots unable to maintain heading through the gravitational distortion. The remaining 2 pressed through, flying on the one instrument that still gave clean data. Marin's targeting feed, transmitted from the Ardennes navigation console and immune to local gravitational interference, because it was calculated from the macro-scale pulse data, not from local sensor readings. Dagger 3, adjust bearing 2 degrees starboard, Marin transmitted, her voice flat and steady. Each correction was calculated against the real-time model running on her console. Dagger 7, you are drifting high. Come down 1.5 degrees. Spearhead lead, your primary target has displaced 14 kilometers to port. Updating coordinates. 5 minutes. The 6th gravitational wave hit. The Ardennes shuddered hard. A conduit housing behind Marin's station ruptured, spraying coolant mist across the navigation alcove in a chemical fog that stung her eyes and coated her displays with a wet film. She wiped her primary screen with her sleeve without looking away from the gravitational data. The targeting feed stayed clean. Her corrections continued without interruption. The destroyer Voss reported structural warnings across her forward quarter. The Resolute was venting atmosphere from a hairline breach on Deck 4, Section 7, her damage control teams sealing the compartment while the surrounding sections held pressure. The battle group was coming apart in slow motion, each gravitational wave peeling another layer of structural resilience from ships that had been built to fight with kinetic energy and directed radiation, not to endure the fundamental forces of the universe turned against them. 4 minutes. Inside the formation, the fighters threaded between entities that tried to close around them like fingers forming a fist. The Leviathans flowed inward, the wall contracting locally, trying to compress the space and crush the small craft. 3 fighters took damage from gravitational shear that warped their airframes. One was destroyed, compressed into a crumpled mass of alloy by an entity that closed around it faster than the pilot could burn clear. Her call sign winked off the display. Marin noted it, held it for the half-second she could afford, and returned to the targeting data. 44 fighters remained. 3 minutes. The nodes were visible on Marin's display as 7 amber contacts pulsing with their distinctive 3-millisecond lag. Each node was surrounded by a cluster of guardian entities that had drawn tight around their positions as the fighters approached. The collective understood what the nodes were worth. It was protecting them with concentrated force. But the protection geometry faced the problem Marin had designed the strike to create. 24 separate fighter flights were inbound on 24 different approach vectors, each targeting a different node. The Guardian entities had to defend all 7 nodes from all 24 vectors simultaneously. Every entity committed to guarding a node was an entity not maintaining the wall, not generating attack waves, not pressing the assault on the battle group's weakening warships. The collective's own architecture was being turned against it. The nodes that made the hive function were the nodes that demanded the most protection, and protecting them was consuming the resources the hive needed to fight. 2 minutes. Marin watched the node pulse timing with absolute focus. 3.2 milliseconds, 3.4, 3.6. The nodes were running hotter than at any point in the engagement, processing combat coordination, evasion commands, guardian positioning, attack wave generation, and formation maintenance simultaneously. Their computational overhead was climbing towards saturation. The 3-millisecond delay that was their architectural signature was stretching because they were running out of bandwidth. They were at capacity. The network infrastructure that made the collective a weapon was maxing out. All flights final bearing confirmed, Marin transmitted. Execute on my mark. She watched the pulse data. One more cycle. The timing offset stabilized at 3.6 milliseconds, the node's maximum demonstrated processing speed. The Guardian entities were locked in their protective positions. The attack vectors were aligned. The math was right. She knew it the way she knew navigational hazards, the way she knew when data was lying, the way she knew that the thing behind her eyes had never been wrong. Mark. 24 flights fired simultaneously. Short-range kinetic interceptors, point defense weapons repurposed for the single most precise strike coordination ever run from a Terran Strategic Navy navigation console. Each round was small, fast, and close enough that the flight time was measured in fractions of a second. The Guardian entities tried to flow. Some succeeded, opening gaps. But the fire was converging from too many vectors on targets that could not displace far enough to evade. Time to arrive within a window so tight that the node's own 3.6 millisecond processing delay was longer than the reaction time available. 7 impacts. 7 nodes struck by multiple rounds from multiple vectors within a window of 0.8 seconds. Not simultaneous to a human eye, but simultaneous to a system that measured its existence in milliseconds. 7 detonations of disrupted matter. 7 gravitational pulse sources that spiked once, broadcasting a single uncoordinated burst across every frequency, and then went dark. For 1.3 seconds, the wall held its shape. The remaining 46 entities continued on their previous headings, their gravitational pulses still cycling at the combat frequency. For 1.3 seconds, Marin stared at her display and waited to find out if she had been right. Then the frequencies diverged. One entity's pulse fell out of synchronization. Then 3 more. Then a cascade, each entity defaulting to its own natural oscillation frequency as the routing network that had kept them synchronized went silent. The shared heartbeat that had united 53 organisms into a single hunting intelligence fragmented into 46 separate rhythms, none of them matching, none of them coordinating, the gravitational equivalent of an orchestra whose conductor had vanished mid-performance. The wall broke. Entities that had maintained precise geometric relationships for 11 days drifted apart. The planar formation warped, buckled, and dissolved into a disorganized cloud of individual organisms, each still massing 600,000 tons, each still dangerous, but none of them connected to the distributed intelligence that had made them a weapon. Some continued forward on inertia. Others veered away, their propulsive gravitational pulses becoming erratic as they tried to navigate without the network that had processed their every movement. Two entities collided, their uncoordinated paths bringing them together at a closing speed that crushed both into a mass of disrupted biological material. The wall that had been squeezing 7 human warships apart with gravity became a scattered cloud of confused organisms, blind to each other, deaf to each other, alone for the first time in however long they had been a collective. "Fire," Captain Hargrove said. The Ardennes rail guns spoke. This time, when the tungsten penetrators entered the dispersing cloud, the entities did not flow apart in coordinated evasion. Some tried. Their individual responses were sluggish, each organism reacting on its own without knowledge of what its neighbors were doing. Slugs that one entity dodged struck the one drifting behind it. The cruisers Resolute and Caledon added their fire. The Tempest, back online with partial power restored, contributed what she could. The Meridian launched a full torpedo spread from her forward tubes, 36 warheads arcing into the cloud on guidance solutions that tracked individual gravitational signatures. The fighters, pulling back to safe distance after the node's strike, turned and made strafing runs on targets of opportunity, their pilots engaging organisms that had been, 90 seconds ago, components of the most lethal collective intelligence humanity had ever encountered, and were now drifting alone, unable to coordinate defense, unable to flee in formation, unable to be what they had been. In 11 minutes, Battle Group Scythe destroyed 29 Leviathan entities. Magnetic accelerator rounds punched through biological structures that had never evolved to resist kinetic impact because they had never needed to. The network had always evaded for them. The tungsten penetrators tore through dark ovoid bodies that split apart on impact, spilling no fluid but releasing bursts of gravitational distortion that rippled outward like the death throes of something that had spoken in the language of spacetime and was now losing the ability to form words. Torpedoes found targets that could not coordinate point defense, warheads detonating against surfaces that had never felt the concussive force of directed explosives. Fighters strafed organisms that turned in confused circles, their gravitational pulses cycling at frequencies that no longer matched anything nearby, each entity broadcasting its distress on a frequency that no other entity was listening to. The remaining 17 broke and scattered into the dust cloud in 17 different directions, their pulses fading on Marin's display as they passed beyond sensor range. Some fled fast, their gravitational propulsion surging with the raw, uncoordinated power of fear, or whatever analog these organisms possessed for self-preservation. Others drifted slowly, their pulses weak and irregular, as if the severance from the collective had damaged something fundamental in their ability to function independently. One entity, the last to leave the engagement volume, paused for 4.7 seconds before turning away, its gravitational output cycling through a rapid sequence of frequencies that Marin's instruments recorded but could not interpret. It might have been searching for its lost network. It might have been calling out to nodes that would never answer. Then it too was gone. 17 individual organisms fleeing alone through an expanse they had once hunted as a single mind. The silence afterward was absolute. Marin sat at her console and watched the last amber contact dissolve beyond detection. Her hands were trembling. She did not know when that had started. The coolant mist from the ruptured conduit had settled on everything. Her uniform, her hair, her skin, her console, the deck plating beneath her boots. The navigation alcove was coated in a faint chemical sheen that caught the combat blue bridge lighting and made everything look as if it existed slightly underwater. The tightness behind her eyes was gone. For the first time in hours, the pressure that had been building since she first noticed the anomaly had released, leaving behind an emptiness that felt less like relief and more like the space left after something essential had been removed. She had poured everything she had into the data, into the 3-millisecond delay, into the targeting packages and the real-time corrections, and now that it was over, the well was dry. The instrument she had been playing for 4 hours had gone silent, and the silence was louder than the combat had been. Captain Hargrove crossed the bridge to her station. He stood behind her chair for a long moment, looking at the display that now showed nothing but the battle group's 7 ships and the residual thermal signatures of 29 destroyed organisms cooling in the void. Then he placed one hand on the back of her chair, the only physical gesture she had seen him make on the bridge in 6 years of service. "How did you know, Solvay?" She looked down at her hands. The trembling was fading, replaced by an exhaustion so deep and so thorough that it felt geological, as if the adrenaline that had sustained the last 4 hours had been the only thing standing between her and a collapse that would take days to resolve. "I did not know, sir. I read the data. The 3-millisecond delay. Once I saw it, everything else followed. If you build a network that routes through relay nodes, those nodes become your architecture, and architecture is constraint. I found the constraint. You identified 7 targets inside a formation of 53, defined by a 3-millisecond timing offset in gravitational oscillations, designed a simultaneous strike from 24 vectors with a 0.8-second execution window, and ran the entire engagement from a navigation console. The navigation console has the best gravitational sensor interface on the ship, sir. It is designed for course plotting through complex gravitational fields. I repurposed the computational framework." Hargrove looked at her for a moment longer. Then he lifted the fleet-wide communications handset. "All ships, Battle Group Scythe, this is Ardennes Actual. Secure from battle stations. Damage assessment and casualty reports to flag within the hour. And let the record reflect that today's engagement was resolved at a navigation console by an officer who repurposed a course-plotting interface to map an alien neural network and coordinated a simultaneous precision strike from a station designed to help us avoid asteroids. The Terran Strategic Navy builds its warships for combat. It appears to build its navigators for something rather more decisive. Ardennes out." Marin turned back to her display. The Koreth expanse was quiet. The background radiation had settled into its natural, patternless static. No heartbeat, no rhythmic compression, just dust and empty space and the fading heat of things that had been alive and coordinated and terrifying, and were now neither. She opened a new file on her console and began drafting her after-action navigation report. Section 1. Methodology for detecting subthreshold gravitational anomalies in high-noise electromagnetic environments. Section 2. Pulse timing analysis as a diagnostic framework for mapping distributed biological network architecture in real-time combat conditions. Section 3. Recommended modifications to standard Terran Strategic Navy passive sensor protocols, with emphasis on gravitational band monitoring in regions of anomalous ship disappearance. Section 4. Proposed tactical doctrine for engaging collective intelligence entities with distributed processing architectures. 4,600 crew across 7 ships, 29 entities destroyed. 1 destroyer requiring shipyard-level structural reconstruction. 4 fighters lost, 3 pilots recovered. 11 crew members across the formation injured by secondary effects of structural damage, concussions from buckling panels, lacerations from shattered instrument covers. 1 broken arm sustained when a weapons technician on the Caledon was thrown against a bulkhead by the 5th gravitational wave. The cost, measured in numbers that could be filed and archived, and compared against other engagements in the Navy's records. But the numbers did not capture the sound of the Kingsford's keel bending, or the 11 seconds of darkness on the Tempest when every soul aboard waited to learn whether the reactor would restart, or the moment when a fighter pilot's call sign disappeared from the display, and the void where it had been held, for 1/2 second, the full weight of a life that was over. And somewhere in the Korath expanse, 17 Leviathan entities drifted alone for the first time in their existence, their gravitational pulses cycling at individual frequencies that matched nothing, connected to nothing, part of nothing. They were alive. They were dangerous. They were 600,000 tons each of biological structure that could compress space-time with a thought. But they were not a collective. Not anymore. The 7 nodes that had made them one weapon were cooling debris in the void, and without that architecture, 17 individuals were 17 problems, not one catastrophe. The Terran Strategic Navy would return. The Admiralty would send research vessels and additional battle groups. The remaining 17 would be found, studied, and dealt with. The Korath expanse would become the most analyzed region of space in human history. But that was all later. That was for admirals and strategists and the machinery of institutional response. Now, in the aftermath, in the quiet of a bridge still fogged with coolant mist and lit in combat blue, Lieutenant Commander Marin Salve saved her report, closed her secondary displays, and allowed herself one moment of perfect stillness. The data had been there for 11 days, hiding in the noise, buried in the background static, patient, rhythmic, almost invisible. 53 organisms pretending to be nothing while they studied 7 warships and learned how to kill them. She had found the heartbeat because finding things that should not be there was what she did. She had mapped the architecture because architecture was what navigation officers understood. And when the architecture revealed a constraint, she had done what navigators have always done when the chart shows a way through something that looks impassable. She charted the course, and the battle group followed her through.